For 9 days in December of 1944, the German gunners outside Bastogne poured a fortune in 88mm rounds into a command bunker that had no commander in it. The bunker was empty. It had always been empty. It was built to be shelled. The man who built it stood 80 yards back, in a hole roofed with brush and snow, and listened to them waste their steel on his lie. His name, in this story, I have changed. The unit, the sector, the engineering, and the dates are real. He was a technical sergeant in a combat engineer outfit attached to the line west of Bastogne, and before the war, he had painted signs and built parade floats and store window displays in a small town in Pennsylvania. He knew how to make plywood look like marble, and a flatboard look like a barrel. He knew, better than any man in that company, that a thing did not have to be real to be believed. It only had to be believed at the right distance, in the right light, by a tired man looking through a gun sight. They called him the Scarecrow Man. They did not mean it kindly. The decoy still showed on an aerial photograph I was handed in 1979 by a man whose father had flown the spotter run. You can see 2 bunkers in the snow. One is a smear of black craters, the earth around it chewed open, the timber splintered and thrown. The other, the smaller one set back in the trees, is untouched. The man who showed me the photograph put his thumb on the cratered one and said, "That's the famous one." And then he moved his thumb to the small one and said nothing for a while. The famous one was the fake. The sergeant, I'll call him Walt Bricker, got off the back of a deuce and a half on the 14th of December, in a wood line that smelled of pine resin and diesel, and the particular cold that comes before snow. The cold that has a taste to it, faintly metallic, like a coin held on the tongue. He was 31. He had a long face, a sign painter's steady hands, and a canvas roll of brushes in his musette bag that he had carried across France and would carry to the end. He did not look like a man who would matter to anything. That was, in a way, the whole point of him. The sector was a mess. The line west of Bastogne in mid-December was not a line at all, so much as a scatter of outposts and crossroads and farm buildings held by men who did not yet know that the entire weight of the German winter offensive was about to come down on top of them. Bricker's company commander, a captain named Hollis, who had a head cold and a map case and not much patience, walked him along a low ridge above a frozen creek and told him what he wanted. He wanted a regimental command post, underground, covered, defensible, a place where the colonel and his staff could run the sector without an airburst putting shrapnel through the situation map and everybody around it. Hollis pointed at the obvious spot, a knob of high ground with a clear field of view, the place any officer's eye went to first. Bricker looked at it and said nothing for a moment. He was already seeing the problem with it, the way a man who paints signs sees instantly that a letter is a half-inch off-center, while everyone else thinks it looks fine. The obvious spot was obvious to the Germans too. Any forward observer with a pair of field glasses and an afternoon would mark that knob as the place a command post ought to go. And then the German artillery, which was patient and methodical and very good, would register it and file the coordinates and wait. Bricker had seen a CP take a direct hit once, back in the hedgerow country in the summer. He had seen what an airburst does to men packed into a room around a map. He did not describe it to me, and I did not ask. He only said, of that day near Bastogne, that he stood on the captain's knob of high ground and felt the back of his neck go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, and that he knew before he'd unrolled a single sketch that he was not going to build the colonel's bunker where the colonel's bunker was supposed to go. The trouble was telling anyone that. The squad he'd been given was 8 men, tired, half of them new, and a buck sergeant named Earl Doyle, who had been running them since their last sergeant was killed at Mortain, and who did not want a tech sergeant from the engineers handed down on top of him like a Christmas package. Doyle was broad and short, and had a way of standing with his weight back on his heels, looking up at a taller man that turned the disadvantage of his height into a kind of dare. He had been in the army a long time. He had opinions about engineers, and the opinions were not warm. The squad's first night in the sector was spent in the open, in foxholes hacked from ground that was freezing harder by the hour, and the next morning Bricker walked the ground alone in the grey light before the others were up. He paced the captain's knob. He paced the low draw behind it, where the trees came down thick to the creek and a man could move without showing himself against the sky. He found, in the draw, a fold of ground with good drainage and overhead concealment, and a back door toward the rear. A place no observer would think to look, because it offered no view and no glory, and looked, from any direction, like nothing at all. He stood in it for a long time, with his breath smoking. Then he took out his sketchbook and a stub of pencil, and began to draw 2 bunkers instead of 1. He was still drawing when Doyle found him. What happened next is the part of this story that the men who were there remembered longest, longer than the shelling, longer than the cold. Doyle came down the slope with 2 of the new men behind him, looking for the engineer who was supposed to be telling them where to dig, and he found that engineer sitting on an ammunition crate in a useless hollow, with no view of anything, drawing pictures. Doyle looked over his shoulder at the sketchbook. There were 2 structures on the page. One was carefully detailed, a full bunker, beams and revetment, and a stovepipe, and an entrance, drawn the way Bricker drew everything, with a craftsman's exactness. The other was smaller, set off in the corner of the page, and Bricker had labelled it in small block capitals that Doyle, leaning in, could read upside down. The big one said, "Decoy." The small one said, "CP." Doyle did not understand it at first, and then he understood it exactly, and the understanding made him angrier than confusion would have. He told Bricker, in front of the 2 new men, and in language I will not put on the page, that he was not going to have his squad break their backs in this cold, building a fake bunker for the Germans to shoot at, while the colonel sat in a rabbit hole in the trees. He said it was a sign painter's trick. He said the army had a manual for command post construction, and the manual did not say anything about building a haunted house to fool anybody. He picked up the field manual that was sitting on the crate beside Bricker, the engineer's own dog-eared copy, and he slapped it down flat on the snow at Bricker's feet so the pages splayed open, and he said, "Build what's in the book. Build it where the captain told you." And he gave Bricker the name that would follow him through the next 3 weeks. The name the whole company would use, half a joke and half a charge of cowardice. The Scarecrow Man, the engineer who builds dummies because he's scared to build the real thing where the real thing belongs. Then he kicked over the line of stakes Bricker had set that morning to lay out the decoy, and he walked off up the slope, and the 2 new men, who a minute earlier had been ready to follow the tech sergeant's instructions, looked at the kicked-over stakes and the splayed manual and the long-faced engineer sitting on his crate, and they followed Doyle. Bricker did not say anything. He had learned a long time ago, painting signs for men who knew nothing about painting and were certain they knew everything, that there was no profit in arguing with a man who had already decided. He sat on the crate a while longer in the cold. Then he leaned down and picked the field manual up out of the snow, and he closed it carefully, and he brushed the snow off the cover with the side of his hand, the way you'd brush crumbs off a tablecloth. He looked at the two sketches on his pad, the careful big lie and the small plain truth, and he understood that he was going to have to build both of them, mostly alone, against the manual, against the captain's pointing finger, against Doyle, and the name Doyle had hung on him, and that the only argument he would ever get to make was the one the German guns would make for him, days from now, if he lived that long, and built it right. He picked his stakes up out of the snow, one at a time, and set them back in their places. Then he started to dig. The pressure came down from above before Bricker had moved 100 shovelfuls. By the morning of the 16th, the wood was full of rumour, and by noon, the rumour had a shape. Something big was breaking loose to the north and east. Men who had been told they were in a quiet sector, a rest sector, a place to refit and get warm, began to understand that they were standing directly in front of whatever was coming. Captain Hollis came down the ridge a second time, and this time he did not have patience for sketches at all. He had a map case under his arm, and a runner at his heel, and a date he kept repeating like a man pressing on a bruise. The colonel wanted the command post functional in 72 hours. Not finished, functional. Wire run, situation map up, staff under cover, before whatever was massing in the east arrived on top of them. Hollis did not ask Bricker how the work was going. He pointed at the captain's knob, the high ground, the obvious ground, and he said, "There." He said the colonel had walked it himself and liked the field of view. He said the regiment had 3 battalions strung across this sector and a gap on the left flank wide enough to drive a column through, and that the last thing he needed was his engineer playing games in a gully. Build it on the knob. 72 hours. Bricker stood at the bottom of the drawer with his shovel and looked up at the captain, and he made the only argument he was ever any good at making. He did not say the knob was wrong. He had learned that telling an officer he was wrong was the fastest way to make sure the thing got built wrong anyway. Instead, he asked the captain a question. He asked how many German batteries he thought had that knob plotted already. He asked how long the captain thought a forward observer needed, with the weather clearing, to mark the one piece of high ground in the sector that looked like a headquarters and call it in. He said he would build the colonel his command post in 72 hours. He would build it, covered and dry and ready. And he would build the colonel a second headquarters on that knob, so handsome and so obvious that every German gun within range would spend a week trying to kill it, while the colonel ran his battle from the trees and never lost a man to it. Hollis looked at him a long moment. He had a head cold and a flank he couldn't cover, and a corps headquarters screaming at him over a field telephone. And he did not have the time or the surplus of certainty to fight an engineer who was, at least, promising to meet the deadline. He said, "You've got your 72 hours either way. If the colonel's staff isn't under cover when this thing breaks, it's your stripes." And he went back up the ridge, and he did not say yes, and he did not say no, which in the army is the same as being told to go ahead and being given nobody to blame but yourself. That was the opening Bricker needed. It was not approval. It was the absence of a direct order to stop. And a man who has spent his life doing work other men don't understand learns to live in that narrow gap and build fast before it closes. The squad still would not help him with the decoy. Doyle saw to that. So for the first day and a half, Bricker built the real command post, the small one, the one that mattered. With the two men, Hollis grudgingly spared him and his own hands, while Doyle's riflemen dug their fighting holes along the ridge and watched the engineer disappear into the trees with his stakes and his string and his sign painter's roll of brushes, and laughed about the haunted house he was building down in the gully. There was one man who did not laugh. His name was Pulaski, and he was the company cook, which on the line meant he was the man who came up after dark with the Marmite cans and the ammunition that rode up on the same jeep, because a kitchen truck and an ammo run used the same road and the same darkness. Pulaski was a heavy, slow-moving man from the steel country near Pittsburgh, with burn scars on both forearms from a lifetime over hot ranges, first in his father's mill canteen and then in the army. He found Bricker the second night, sitting alone at the mouth of the real CP in the dark, too tired to walk back up the ridge for chow, and he set down a Marmite can of something hot and a canteen cup and sat on the spoil pile beside him without being asked. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that has nothing to do with bunkers, and it is the part that one of the survivors talked about longest when I sat with him in 1981 in a kitchen in Ohio, 40 years after. Pulaski and Bricker were both from the same kind of place: mill towns, river towns, towns where men made things with their hands, and the making was the whole of a man's pride. They did not talk about the war. They talked about home, the way men do at night at the edge of a frozen wood, when the talking is the only warm thing available. Pulaski had a daughter he had never seen, born in October, and a photograph that had come up in the mail with the ammunition that night, and he showed it to Bricker by the light of a shielded match. One cupped flame, two cold men leaning their heads together over a square of paper. And then the match went out, and they sat in the dark and did not say anything for a while. Bricker told Pulaski about the decoy, because Pulaski was the only man who asked instead of laughed. He explained it the way he understood it, that the Germans were not stupid, that they would look for a headquarters and they would find one, and that the only question was whether the one they found was the one with the colonel in it or the one with nothing in it but the smell of smoke and the look of importance. Pulaski listened the way a man listens who has spent his life making something out of nothing in a hot kitchen at 4 in the morning. When Bricker was done, Pulaski said the thing that Bricker carried with him for the rest of the war. He said, "So you're feeding the wrong dog on purpose." And Bricker said, "That's exactly it. That's exactly the whole of it." After that, Pulaski helped. Not with the heavy work. He had a kitchen to run and a road to drive in the dark, but with the small things that mattered to the lie. He saved his cooking grease and his wood ash. He brought up a length of stovepipe nobody would miss. He understood before any of the riflemen did that the decoy had to look lived in, had to smell lived in, had to breathe, and that a cold, dead bunker fools nobody. He became, without anybody ordering it, the first member of Bricker's real crew, the Scarecrow Man and the cook. Now I should tell you who Bricker was, because the work that came next did not come out of nowhere. It came out of a particular life. He had grown up in a small town in the western part of Pennsylvania, in a valley where the main industry was a glassworks, and the second industry was the painting and lettering and decorating that a town does to itself. The gold leaf on the bank window, the name of the funeral parlor in a serious Roman face, the banners and the floats for the 4th of July and the Harvest Fair. His father had been a sign painter and a scene painter, and had done the backdrops for the opera house when the opera house still ran, painting a forest so deep you wanted to walk into it on a canvas flat 8 feet from the front row. The boy learned the trade by sweeping the shop and grinding the colors, and eventually by holding the brush. What a scene painter learns before he learns anything else is that the eye is lazy, and the eye wants to be fooled. The eye fills in. Give it 3 correct details, and it will invent the other 20 for you. A flat board, painted with a grain and a sheen, and one knot in the right place, becomes oak. A row of windows, painted on a wall, with the highlights set as if the morning sun was striking them, becomes a building. The trick is never to paint everything. The trick is to paint the 3 things the eye checks, and let the eye do the rest. Bricker's father used to say that a good fake is mostly the watcher's own mind, and that the painter's whole job is to give that mind a place to start. He carried other things up from that life besides the trick of the eye. He carried the brushes, a roll of them in waxed canvas, sable and bristle, that he cleaned every night, no matter how tired he was, because his father had told him a man who lets his brushes go stiff has stopped being a craftsman and become a laborer. He carried a draftsman's discipline, the habit of drawing the thing fully before building it, of measuring twice, of standing back and squinting. And he carried a particular quiet, the quiet of a man used to working alone on a scaffold, while a crowd below him decided he was wasting paint. The quiet that does not argue and does not explain, and simply keeps working until the thing is finished and the crowd shuts up. All of that was about to be useful. Some of it was about to keep men alive. The ground was the first enemy. It was freezing harder every night, and by the 17th, the top 8 inches were like fired clay, and the picks rang off it and threw sparks. Bricker had built the real CP into the fold of the drawer, down where the trees broke the wind, and the drainage carried the meltwater away from the floor instead of into it. And he had roofed it the way he meant to, not flat, the way the manual drew it and the way Doyle wanted it, but with the heaviest timber laid in 2 courses, with the top course canted, and a layer of fresh earth and snow over that to kill the shadow and the shape. He worked on the real one in the grey hours and saved the decoy for the daylight, because the decoy was supposed to be seen, and the real one was not. And all the while, the ticker ran. Every man on the ridge could feel it now. The artillery to the east had a different sound than it had 3 days before, heavier and more constant, a grinding at the edge of hearing that did not stop at night. Refugees began to come down the road in the dark, civilians from the villages east of them pushing carts. And that was the worst sign of all, because civilians know before the army does when a place is about to be lost. Hollis's 72 hours were running out. The gap on the left flank had not been filled. And somewhere out in the snow to the east, a German artillery officer with a map and a pair of good field glasses was waiting for the weather to lift so he could find a headquarters to kill. On the night of the 18th, alone at the decoy, with the cold coming through his boots and the picks ringing off the frozen knob, Bricker stopped digging and stood and made the decision that the whole thing turned on. He could build the decoy honest and slow, the way he wanted, and maybe not finish in time. Or he could build it the way a sign painter builds, fast, false, all front and no back, 3 correct details, and let the German eye invent the rest. He looked at the obvious knob and the careful drawing in his head, and he chose the painter's way. He chose to build a lie well instead of a truth slowly. Then he picked up the pick again, and the sound of it carried down the ridge in the cold. One man working alone where a squad should have been, building a headquarters that would never hold a single living man, and was meant, from the first stake, to die. The decoy almost failed before it was finished, and it failed for the reason fakes always fail. It was too perfect. Bricker had built the dummy bunker fast and well. Too well. By the morning of the 19th, it sat on the captain's knob, looking exactly like what it was supposed to be. A headquarters. A squared-off mound, a timbered entrance with a real door salvaged off a wrecked farmhouse. A stovepipe rising from the crown. The spoil heaped around it the way real digging heaps it. And standing back from it in the grey light, squinting the way his father had taught him to squint, Bricker saw the floor. It looked like a stage set. It looked finished and clean and still. It had no life in it. A real command post in a fighting sector is never still. Men come and go. Smoke rises and falls as a fire is fed and lets down. A jeep cuts the same track in the snow a dozen times a day. Wire runs out from it in a tangle. The eye that hunts for a headquarters does not look for a building. It looks for the signs of men. And Bricker had built a building. This is the discovery the whole video turns on, and it is the opposite of what most people imagine a decoy to be. You do not fool an artillery observer by building something that looks like a bunker. You fool him by building the mess that men leave around a bunker. The observer reads the traffic, not the timber. So Bricker stopped building the bunker and started building the life around it. He ran a phantom of activity across that knob over the next 2 days, and every piece of it was a thing he understood from a different trade. He cut wire and ran it out from the dummy entrance in a believable tangle. Not too neat, staff wire to nowhere, splices, a reel left on its side. He had Pulaski's Jeep, on its nightly ammunition run, swing wide, and cut a fresh vehicle track up to the knob and back, twice a night, so the snow showed the come and go of a place that mattered. He scuffed boot paths between the dummy and the latrine he dug 40 feet off, because nothing says a position is occupied like the worn track to its latrine. He even built the latrine. A fake headquarters needs a real privy, he told Pulaski, or it isn't lying hard enough. And he built the chimney to breathe. This was the heart of it, the detail that the German guns would read above all the others. And it was the detail Bricker had thought about first, back on the 14th, when he stood on the knob and felt the cold on his neck. Smoke is the surest sign of a manned position in a winter line. A cold position is empty. A smoking position is alive. So the dummy's stovepipe, Pulaski's length of salvaged pipe, set into a small hearth Bricker dug into the side of the mound, had to put up smoke, real smoke, on a believable schedule. Morning and evening, the times a real staff would warm itself and cook. Thin and steady at first, then a heavier draw, the way a fire builds when a cold man feeds it. Ricker fed that fire himself, in the dark, with Pulaski's saved grease and damp wood that smoked the way he wanted. And he learned to read his own smoke from 80 yards off, from the trees, the way a German observer would read it, and to adjust the damper of green boughs he'd rigged at the pipe's base, until the column looked exactly like the breath of men who were not there. It was a strange thing to stand in the freezing dark and tend a fire that warmed nobody, that existed only to be seen, that was in every sense a painting made of smoke. I have thought about that a good deal over the years. The sign painter who had spent his life making flat things look round and dead things look alive, now making an empty hill look like a beating heart, by hand, one fed fire at a time, so that the enemy would aim at the picture and not the men. There is a line in the after-action report of the engineer battalion this man served with. I have read it. It is a dry document, 2.5 pages. It does not give his name. And the line is this: deception positions in the sector were maintained with simulated occupation, including controlled smoke and vehicular tracks, and drew a substantial volume of enemy fire away from actual command and supply installations. That is the whole of it, in the language of the army. 23 words. Behind those 23 words is a man standing alone in the snow before dawn, feeding a fire to a hole in the ground while the guns warmed up to the east. The break in the man came on the night of the 20th, and I include it because the survivor who told me this part wanted it told, and because a story where the hero never falters is a story nobody who was there believes. It was the coldest night yet, well below zero, the kind of cold that gets into the seams of a man and makes every small task a negotiation. Ricker had been awake most of 3 nights. The real CP was nearly ready, and the colonel's staff would move in at dawn. And he stood at the decoy at perhaps 2 in the morning, with the fire he was supposed to feed gone down to almost nothing, and his hands too cold to feel the green boughs. And he thought, very clearly and very simply, that he could let it go out. No one would know. No one was watching him in the dark. The riflemen on the ridge were asleep or frozen at their posts, and did not care whether the Scarecrow man's stupid fire burned or not. Doyle thought the whole thing was a fraud. The captain hadn't said yes. He could walk down into the warm, real CP and sleep, and let the fire die. And in the morning, he could say the wood was wet, and the deception would be a little weaker. Just one cold night out of many, and it would almost certainly not matter. He stood there a long time with that thought. He told the survivor years later that it was not laziness, and it was not even the cold, exactly. It was that the lie had no one to thank it. A real bunker, you build it and men sleep in it, and you can see what you did. This thing, he could only watch the Germans hit if it worked. And if it worked perfectly, the reward was that nothing happened to anybody, and no one ever knew why. He was being asked to do the hardest work of his life for an audience of enemy gunners who he hoped would never understand what they were looking at. And then he thought about Pulaski's daughter in the photograph, born in October, never seen, and the warm, real CP 80 yards back, where in a few hours the colonel and his staff and the men who ran the wire and the men who brought the coffee would all be sitting around a map, and how all of them, every one, were alive right now. Partly because a fire on an empty hill was telling a lie well. And he got down on his knees in the snow, and he blew on the coals with the last warm air in his chest until they caught, and he fed the green boughs in, one at a time, with fingers he could not feel, and he built the smoke back up, and he stayed until dawn. Doyle came down off the ridge that same grey morning, and the antagonist of this story is not a cartoon, so I will give him his due here, because what he said next was the truest thing he said in the whole of it. He stood at the foot of the decoy and watched Bricker banking the fire he'd fought all night to keep, and he did not sneer this time. He looked tired himself and older than the day before. He said he'd had a sergeant once, back in the August fighting, a clever man, an engineer like Bricker, who'd rigged a thing, a tripwire arrangement on an approach, a gadget, and who had been so sure of his own cleverness that he'd put men in front of it to wait, and the gadget had failed when it counted, and some of those men had not come home, and Doyle had helped carry them himself. He said cleverness gets riflemen killed. He said the army wrote the manual flat and simple, and built it out of plain men digging plain holes, because plain holes dug right keep more men alive than one genius's trick, and that every time some bright fellow decided he was smarter than the book, somebody who wasn't smart at all paid for it. He said all of that not as a taunt, but as a kind of warning, almost a plea, the words of a man who had stood at the edge of a hole with a folding shovel and helped fill it in over a friend's face. Bricker listened. He did not argue. He understood, standing there, that Doyle was not a fool, and was not even wrong about the thing Doyle was actually talking about, which was not the decoy at all, but a dead man named something Bricker never learned, in an orchard in Normandy, 4 months gone. He only said, when Doyle was finished, that this trick didn't ask anybody to stand in front of it. That was the difference. His lie kept men back, not forward. The fire warmed nobody and risked nobody. And Doyle looked at him for a moment and looked at the smoke going up off the empty hill, steady and convincing and warming not one living soul. And he didn't say anything else. He went back up the ridge. It was the first time he hadn't had the last word. By dusk, the staff had moved into the real CP. The map went up on the timber wall in the dark, and the field telephones came alive, and the place that was never supposed to be found settled in under its canted roof and its blanket of snow and earth, 80 yards back in the trees, breathing no smoke at all. And out on the knob, the decoy stood in the last light, with its honest mess of wire and tracks and its dishonest heart of fire, finished at last, a headquarters that had cost one man more labor than the real one, and would never house a living thing. That night, the snow stopped, and the cloud began to thin, and somewhere to the east, a man with field glasses could finally see the ridge. The weather Bricker had been racing was about to lift. Down in the real CP, a runner came in with the word everybody had been waiting 3 days for. The word that turned all the labor into either the smartest thing a man in that sector ever did, or the cruelest waste of one man's strength in the whole regiment. The Germans were registering targets along the ridge. Fire was coming at first light. It came at first light on the 21st, and it did not come the way men in the movies flinch from a single shell. It came as a registration first, one round, then a long pause, then a correction, then another, a gunner walking his fire onto a target with the patience of a man threading a needle. Bricker was in the real CP when the first round went over. He knew the sound of a ranging shot. He went still, and so did everyone in the bunker, the colonel and the staff and the wire men, all of them listening to a noise that was deciding, somewhere out in the snow, where it would land. It landed on the knob. The first one was long, throwing a black fountain of frozen earth 20 yards past the dummy. The second was short. The third walked onto the decoy and burst on the spoil heap, and the fourth came down on the timbered entrance Bricker had salvaged from the farmhouse, and the door he had hung for no man to open blew across the hill in pieces. In the real CP, 80 yards back under the canted roof, the colonel's staff felt the ground jump and heard the steel come down on the wrong hill, and the colonel, I am told, looked up from his map at the timber over his head, and then looked at nothing in particular and went back to his map. They were not under it. The fire was a quarter-mile of cold air away, falling on a lie. Doyle was in the real CP too. This is the part the survivors set most store by, and I will tell it plainly. When the registration started, Bricker had gone up the slope in the half-dark, against sense, against the incoming, to pull in two of his wiremen who were strung out along the ridge in shallow holes. And Doyle had come down off the ridge at the same moment, because the ridge-fighting holes were no place to be with 88s ranging in, and the only covered hole on that hillside that a man could reach and trust was the one the Scarecrow man had built down in the trees. Doyle reached the entrance of the real CP as the fourth round hit the decoy, and he stopped at the mouth of it, the engineer's hidden hole, the rabbit hole in the trees he had mocked for a week. And for 1 second, he did not go in. And then a fifth round came down, and he went in. And Bricker came in behind him with the two wiremen, and they pressed against the timber wall of the bunker the broad, short sergeant had said was the act of a coward. And they listened to it hold. It held for 9 days. I have set down that number twice now, at the beginning and here, because it is the number that matters, and because it is true. From the 21st of December to roughly the 29th, in the worst of the siege, German batteries put fire onto that knob again and again, never in one great storm, but in the patient, recurring, methodical way of good gunners servicing a confirmed headquarters. They corrected. They tried different fuses. On at least 2 occasions, by the count in the records, they put down a concentration heavy enough that a real command post on that knob, with the colonel and his staff inside it, would have ceased to function, and most of the men in it would have died. The decoy took all of it. The timbered mound was pounded into a black smear in the snow. The wire was cut to confetti. The stovepipe was thrown 40 feet. The salvage door was kindling. And 80 yards back, under the canted roof and the snow, the regiment ran its battle through the worst 9 days that sector saw. And the situation map was never knocked off the wall, and the colonel never lost a staff officer to a shell, and the field telephones kept talking. Men lived who would not have lived. I can put numbers on some of them, because the survivors could. The colonel, 3 staff officers, 4 men of the communications section who kept the wire to the battalions open through the encirclement, and the wire to the battalions in those 9 days was the difference between a coordinated defense and a rout. Pulaski, who sheltered in the real CP on his nightly runs when the road was too hot to drive, and who lived to see his daughter in the spring. The 2 wiremen, Bricker pulled off the ridge in the dark, and Doyle, pressed against the timber with his eyes shut and one gloved hand over his ear. The man who had slapped the manual down in the snow, alive, because the coward's hole held. What it cost is part of the truth too, and I won't pretty it. The communications corporal who ran the night wire took a fragment in the thigh on the road, not in the bunker, and kept the line open from a cot inside it, with his leg packed and bound. And he kept it. A rifleman of Doyle's squad, who had laughed at the haunted house and who stayed in his fighting hole on the ridge during the first morning's ranging, because that was the regulation place to be, the flat-roofed hole the book drew, was killed by an airburst over the ridgeline on the second day. The book had drawn his hole, and the book's hole did not hold, and he was 19. I do not draw a moral from it. It is simply what the records show, set next to each other, the hole the book drew, and the hole the sign painter drew, and the men who came out of each. When the fire finally moved off the knob in the last days of December, and the sector held, and the German tide that had broken around Bastogne began to go back the way it came, the vindication came the way the real ones always do, quiet, physical, and almost too late to enjoy. Doyle walked out to the knob on a cold, still morning when the shelling had stopped. He did it alone, before the others were about. Bricker, who slept little, saw him go and followed at a distance and watched. Doyle stood in the cratered ruin of the decoy for a while, turning slowly, reading the ground the way a man reads a thing he is finally willing to understand. Then he crouched. He took out the folding rule that every old soldier carried, the boxwood rule, and he put it against what was left of the canted timber of the dummy's roof. The angle Bricker had built into the fake the same way he'd built it into the real one, and he measured it. He wrote the number in a notebook. He measured the standoff between the decoy and the tree line where the real CP hid, and wrote that too. He paced the false vehicle track and the path to the false latrine, and stood a long time at the dead hearth where the lying fire had burned. And he wrote. And he did not say a word. And he did not know, or did not let on that he knew, that the Scarecrow Man was standing in the trees, watching him do it. That notebook, or one drawn from it, is the reason there is a line in the after-action report at all. Deception was not new to the war. By then, there were whole units, somewhere off to the rear, that did nothing but fake armies into being, with inflatable tanks and recorded engine noise. And any old engineer knew in principle that you could draw fire onto an empty position. What Bricker had done was bring that idea down to one tired squad on one freezing ridge, and make it hold up at the distance of a German gun sight, with a salvaged stovepipe and a cook's grease. The method, as he'd worked it, simulated occupation, controlled smoke, vehicular tracks, the decoy sighted on the obvious ground, and the true installation hidden in dead ground behind it, was written up, and within a few weeks, I'm told, deception positions of that kind were common practice across that sector, encouraged by the same colonel whose life the first one had saved. The Scarecrow Man's trick stopped being one engineer's stubbornness and became something the men around him simply did. Bricker's name is not on it. The names in this story are changed, as I told you at the start, and his real one was sparse in the paperwork even then. The after-action report credits the deception to the battalion, which is the Army's way, and the men who knew better are mostly gone now. Doyle never made a speech about it. He gave Bricker exactly one line, a week or so later, on the road, both of them filthy and the offensive turning. He said, "I'd have put my men on that knob." That was all. It was an admission that he had been wrong in the one way it had mattered, that the book's hole would have killed his squad. And he said it once, and he never said it again. And the two of them understood it perfectly. Bricker told the survivor, decades later, that it was worth more than the Silver Star paperwork that came through that spring, because Doyle was a man who had filled in a hole over a friend's face and still walked out to the knob with a folding rule, willing to be taught by the dead steel what he would not be told by a living man. Bricker came home. He did not become anything you would read about. He went back to the small Pennsylvania town and the Glassworks Valley, and he painted signs again. The bank window, the funeral parlor's Roman face, the harvest fair banners, for another 30 years. A long-faced, quiet man up on a scaffold, while the town below decided he was wasting paint. He kept the brushes clean every night. He did not talk about the war much. The survivor I sat with in Ohio in 1981 said Bricker came to a reunion only once, late, an old man by then, and that somebody had brought a copy of an aerial photograph, 2 bunkers in the snow, and that Bricker had looked at it for a long time and put his thumb on the cratered one, the famous one, the empty one he had bled to build, and had said only that he was glad it had been the ugly one that took the shells. The real CP is gone, pulled apart for timber by the farmer who owned the land, before anyone thought it worth marking. But the knob is still there, west of Bastogne, and the man whose father flew the spotter run told me that on a low evening light, when the snow lies right, you can still read the ring of old craters in the field where the German guns spent 9 days and a fortune in steel, killing a headquarters that was never there. A man built that. He built it to be destroyed, and it did exactly what he built it to do. And almost nobody ever knew his name. The fire that warmed no one. The chimney that breathed for the dead. The best work of his life was a thing he made to be thrown away, and it saved every man it was meant to save. And that, I think, is as much as most of them ever got, and more than most of them asked for.